And with that, hello everyone, and welcome to IT Procurement Is This Accessible, hosted by the IT Accessibility Initiative of the Maryland Department of Disabilities Assistive Technology Program. Just the usual housekeeping items. We do have closed captioning available today. You can enable that by pressing the closed caption button on your menu ribbon. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted onto our YouTube channel within the week. And earlier today, you should have received the slide deck and a copy of the VPAT that we'll be discussing today. If for whatever reason you did not, don't fear, it will be coming out again when I send out the email with the recording. If there's any issues with either document, please let me know, and I will make sure to get you a new copy and address any issues that you might have had. Final thing, if you have any questions today, please hold them to the end. You can either use Q&A or chat. I will try and pay attention to both at that time, but we're going to try and get through the majority of everything in hopes that I answer your questions before we get there. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So today's goals are mostly to talk about how to determine if a product that you're looking at is accessible without having to go through the whole testing process. We'll also discuss the VPAT, the ACR, and then a little bit about working with vendors to figure out where to go from there and how to either remediate the product and make an agreement or determine other solutions that may be needed. So the first thing today is to talk about the ACR. So what is it? ACR stands for Accessibility Conformance Report. The section 508.gov acquisition section calls this documentation describing how the item or items will fully address the accessibility requirements outlined in the solicitation, and a description of the evaluation methods the offer will use to validate for conformance to the revised 508 standards. So that's specifically for federal government and section 508 compliance. Other areas such as Maryland will still use the term ACR and just adjust the definition to fit, obviously, their own laws or standards. Effectively, though, this is something a vendor should provide in order to say, yes, we're accessible, and this is how we know we're accessible. It's proof, because obviously we can claim any of our products to be accessible at any time, but for procurement purposes, we really need to demonstrate that. So that's the benefit of having an ACR involved in the procurement process, in that you can just rely on you can take care of some of the steps ahead of time rather than having to go through the whole testing process yourself. Now, specifically, we want to talk about today is the VPAT. So what is that? VPAT stands for the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. This is a free report format for stating IT solutions conformance with various accessibility standards. And the format has become an industry standard. So most of the time when we're talking about ACRs, we are talking about VPATs. A number of states have started requiring them. Minnesota does, Texas does. Colorado, I believe, is in the process of making it a requirement. We here in Maryland are working towards that as well. Obviously, the federal government has that requirement, and it's just kind of spreading from there. So learning about this is really vital if you're going to be working in procurement, or if you're going to be working with accessibility in general, because the people who are working in procurement will come to you then as the subject matter expert. The nice thing about the template is that there are multiple versions available for different standards. There is the 508 version. There's also the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG. There's that version. There's an EU version, which is not applicable over here, but you still might see if you're dealing with a larger corporation. And then the international version, which incorporates standards from several different countries. So United States, Canada, Japan, EU. And you would see that from companies such as Microsoft that are dealing on a global scale. These reports are updated periodically. I believe the latest one is currently for March 2022. I assume that once we see WCAG 2.2 published, that we'll see a new version updated shortly after that publication. So big thing to remember is that any completed VPAT is an accessibility conformance report, but not every ACR is a VPAT. Vendors can sometimes provide other kinds of reports depending on if they're working with outside vendors or with consultants to develop something, or they might be using just a automatically generated report from whatever tool that they're using. So not every ACR is going to be a VPAT, but in general, the VPAT is kind of what you should look for, because it gives you probably the most information that you can work off of, especially when we need to discuss things like evaluation methods used and such. And then it already kind of has done the work for everyone in the fact that it lists out all the standards and you just have to write in the results of the testing. So most of the time, why recreate the wheel? The VPAT itself is available from the ITAI Council. The link should be in the slide deck for you. All versions are on there. And if there's any updates or changes, that you'll see them on there as well. The ITI Council does allow some modification of it if you need to add like additional guidelines specific to your area, or if you have special needs regarding the product you're evaluating, you can add that to it. The big thing that they have mentioned is that you still need to retain the name VPAT on there and that it was their creation. So essentially, giving credit to them and the rights of the development of the report. So that is the basic definition of the VPAT. So what's the benefit of having this? Why do we ask for this? Why do we care? First off is obviously is a summary of accessibility for comparison points. So comparing product A versus product B to see which is more accessible, quote unquote, depending on the results, and seeing what, are they meeting the needs that we have, or are there other considerations we might need to bring into it. Also for comparing against other criteria such as security or use cases, so that it makes it a lot easier for comparing products against each other without having to go, delay the process further with testing. It does satisfy proof of compliance when you're considering options. So taking care of, at least in Maryland, it's showing not just that you're accessible, but that you're also in line with the Maryland non-visual access clause. That's our version of Section 508 here in Maryland. So it's really important that that be addressed, because while the clause is in there, the clause itself points to an evaluation. So this is just a way to show that without having to go through the entire testing process, as I've said. The other nice thing about it is that if it has been filled out correctly and accurately, it gives you an idea of what issues need to be addressed. Every guideline in the document has a remarks and explanation section where the person who is doing the testing can write in any issues that were found or where issues are located, so that you can again prioritize, is this something that we can fix easily? Is this something that we need to be thinking about because we're going to ask about customization for that area? Or is it an area that we don't intend to use and therefore is not as much of an issue versus other areas that have been marked supported? And then finally, we're holding the vendor responsible then for testing and remediation. Again, the testing process can take a few days depending on the number of people involved with it to determine if something is accessible. And this way, having this report allows for a much faster evaluation without having to go through all of the testing. Hold on a moment, please. We're having a minor technical issue. There we are. Just give me a moment just to check something. All right. It looks like we are back and we're good to go. So great. Thank you everyone for your patience. And let me get back to it. All right. So as I was saying, by holding the vendor responsible for testing and remediation, it does mean that we have a picture of how comfortable they are with accessibility, or if they're working with a trusted third party in order to continually update their product, and have an idea of their approach to accessibility. Is this something that they're not familiar with and that they are still just trying to get a handle on, or is it something that they have processes in place that they can just continuously do this as they're updating their content, which will be ideal. It also means that we have an idea going ahead that we need to have them either fix up an area, or if there is a particular area that might be a problem that we need addressed immediately, or things that we just need to be aware of in the future. And then finally, the fact that we can save time on our end to make sure that we don't have to test every single product that comes through the procurement process, and we only have to test maybe the final product that we are looking to purchase or award that contract to. Now, as with everything, there are cons to using a VPAT. So some concerns regarding the VPAT is that it may not be 100% accurate depending on the author. We're very reliant on the author fully understanding the guidelines and how to test them. So you'll see a wide variety. Again, as I've mentioned, you might see someone who only really is Googling the basics of accessibility. So they might answer the guidelines like 1.1.1, which is on screen for non-text content, but they might not test for something like keyboard only use or something like a screen reader user, because they might load in a screen reader based on what they're reading online, but they don't know really how to operate it. So they just arrow through every element on screen. And if they hear it, they think, oh, it's good, and not realizing that there's more to the interaction there. And then also, there is always the potential that the author is not being 100% truthful. So it very much depends on their skill level, and then them being faithful to the process. And by and large, they should be, but again, there are always times when someone isn't, and we have to be prepared to deal with those. The VPAT itself, as being shown by the accuracy rating, it does require some technical knowledge to fully understand and complete. So both the person filling it out obviously needs to know how to test, but then the person reading it needs to have at least an idea of the guidelines. One of the main things we'll talk about today are some red flags to look for that should prompt you to reach out to a subject matter expert. And then you can rely on their knowledge in order to understand, like, how is this going to impact the usage of and the compliance of the product. And then finally, it is only valid for the listed product and version. These things do easily become outdated, especially as something like software that gets continuous updates over the course of time. So one of the judgment calls is, how accurate is this? And is it something that's needing to be updated, and you're going to need to ask for a new copy or a new test to be done? Essentially, the older the VPAT is, the more likely it's not going to be helpful. So on screen, there is an example of the first two guidelines from the report. It's broken into 3 columns. There's criteria, conformance level, and remarks and explanations. The first row is the first guideline from WCAG 1.1.1, non-text content, level A. It also mentioned that this applies to the revised Section 508 and what parts of Section 508. So you have 501 for web software, 504.2 for authoring tools, and then 602.3 for support docs. So this is from the Section 508 version of the VPAT. So that's why it has both WCAG and Section 508, since Section 508 refers back to WCAG. And then in the conformance level and remarks and explanations columns, those are broken into 4 areas: web, electronic docs, software, and authoring tools. The reason for that is because it's dependent on what the product is, and then anything else that comes along with the product. So like support documentation and help services, something like if you're purchasing a website or a content management system where you have the web application itself needs to be tested, but then if there's any PDFs that go along with it, or is it generating PDFs, those need to be tested as well. And so that would fall under here. So you get to see kind of, if it's filled out accurately, you would see the breakdown of those 2 different areas. So that would cover web software and supporting docs. Something like authoring tool is for the actual creation of content. So that can sometimes be a little bit of a question mark if that applies or not. But in those cases, you would see it being marked not applicable if it is something that the author isn't sure it applies to or knows that they're not providing that kind of product. The second row is for the second guideline, 1.2.1, audio only and video only pre-recorded. Another level A requirement, and then it also mentions the same information as 1.1.1 in terms of Section 508 in those 4 areas. We'll look more at the document itself later, but this is the basic example of the start of the report. Now, how do you read this thing? The first thing to do, honestly, is familiarize yourself with the format. So there's an introduction that explains the product and what was done to test it. And then there is, depending on what version you're using, there's the breakdown of the standards. So for the Section 508 version, it'll start with WCAG, it'll do level A, then it'll do level AA. It only includes 2.0. So if for whatever reason you're requiring 2.1 for your procurement, you'll need to use the WCAG version, which includes 2.1 A and AA standards. Now, each standard has 3 conformance levels. So there's supports, which meets the standard without known defects. There's partially supports, where some elements or functions do not meet the standard. And then not supported, where the majority of the solution does not meet the standard. So one important thing to keep in mind is that partially supports and not supported standards should have an explanation, either stating which elements are not in line with the guideline, and or including any details about why that is happening. Ultimately, we would also hope in some cases where there's a note section, or perhaps the vendor is providing a separate document saying, this is our plan for dealing with it. That's very dependent on the vendor, though, and how much they are including accessibility into their process. So that's always a thing to keep in mind and look for. As I mentioned earlier, sections can be marked not non-applicable, or NA, usually applying to either specific guidelines, such as 1.2.1, if there's no video only or audio only content on the product that you're purchasing, the vendor will likely mark that not applicable. Or in some cases, it might be a whole section, such as Section 508, Chapter 4 on hardware, where if they're not providing any kind of hardware along with a software product, in that case, then they would mark hardware not applicable because they're not providing that kind of product. So this is what to look for in the introduction. So this is the very start of the report, where we have the name of the product and the version. This obviously should match the submitted proposal. If it's not, then first off, if it's not for the product you're buying, then there's no point in looking at the report. The version is where we need to consider how out of date this is. Obviously, generating a report every time an update is made can be burdensome, so most companies will not do that. But is there a difference between 1.7 versus a major update to like 2.0? In those cases, that report is going to have much more inaccuracies versus like 1.7 to 1.8. So that's where you need to make that judgment call of how close is this to the version you're purchasing and such. The report date also helps with that, because the report date decides how far back it is and how many changes have been made since then. Um, Ultimately, at maximum, it should be within a year of submission. We personally recommend that it's within 6 months, because, as I mentioned, the further out you go, the more likely changes have made the report invalid. So within 6 months is ideal. Anywhere from 6 months to a year is still workable, as long as the versions are still kind of matching. But any further out than that, and it's very likely the report is going to be missing either areas that have changed, new areas that have been added and haven't been tested, or reports are missing or labeling content that's been updated and fixed since then. Excuse me. Now the product description should explain the basics of the product. Again, should match the submitted proposal. In most cases, I've seen essentially a copy of the original procurement bid, having the detailed description of the product, and then just copy paste it into the report. In some cases, it's also just, again, the name or something. But as long as that's matching what you're purchasing, that's really all that matters. Contact information, usually that's whoever completed the report, depending on the organization. Either that should be someone inside the solution developer development company that has actually done the report, or has done the testing, or is responsible for the people who've done that testing. But it can also be a third-party consultant. A lot of the times we see organizations secure the services of someone like Level Access or DQ in order to fill out these reports, and they'll put their contact information instead. As long as you have someone to go to regarding any issues with the report, that's really all that matters there. There is a notes section, so any additional information maybe either like from Level Access, like who was doing the testing or how long it took or what tools they used, that kind of thing. So any additional information that may be helpful. Now, the next two items are really the meat of what we need to look at. So the evaluation methods used, they should always mention what tools were used. So you'll see things like Wave or DQ's X program, or something like Site Improve, or Power Mapper, any kind of automated tool. But we're really looking for other things as well, such as manual testing, what manual tests were conducted, if they used a screen reader or any other assistive technology, and then things like different operating system and browser combinations. When we conduct our testing here at the Accessibility Initiative, we work with Windows, with both Chrome and Edge and Firefox, and we also work with Mac OS and Safari and Firefox. So we try both major operating systems along with multiple browsers, trying to cover the most prominent combinations used. So that's really what we're looking for, is ideally multiple methods. Now, sometimes a third-party consultant will not fill that in. They'll just mention their testing process. Depending on the reputation of the consultant, then we can just kind of assume that it's done well. But that's something that you would, if they don't mention that, but they mention a consultant, you might want to reach out to a subject matter expert in order to determine the reputation of that consultant. So evaluation methods can range a lot, but this is really the criteria we're looking for here. And then finally, applicable standards and guidelines. So at the very least, here in Maryland, should either state Section 508 or WCAG 2.0 A and AA standards. So that's what's in the report. If they mention any higher standards, a lot of the times we see people mentioning 2.1 because it is the current published version. Hopefully we'll see 2.2 at some point in the near future. Other people might be mentioning it just because they're starting to work towards that anyway. Any higher standards is always better because they're encompassing more of the accessibility changes that we've seen for areas such as mobile usage, neurological, and speech and physical issues. So always good to see higher standards, but at minimum, we should see Section 508 or WCAG 2.0. If they state any other guidelines or standards, that's something to watch out for. Regarding that, as I stated, last slide, sorry, I mentally combined these two. If a third-party consultant is completing the report, if the testing method only states their name, again, consult an SME to determine the validity. There's a number of really big names in the accessibility sphere. So level access, DQ are probably the two largest. So those are very recognizable and have a very good reputation. But if you're not familiar at all with the names, please reach out. Here in Maryland, our non-visual access clause directly references Section 508 and WCAG 2.0 A and AA criteria. So that is the minimum standard we put here. If for whatever reason they put Maryland NVA, I mean, that's excellent. I would not expect it though, because that would be something, specific to someone working in Maryland. A lot of companies that are dealing with multiple states and such are instead going to state Section 508 if they're working on the federal level, or they're going to work with WCAG because that's the industry and international standard that everyone uses. So as long as they're referencing either of those two, there's enough overlap with NVA that we can draw equal parallels there. If they do mention 2.1 or even 2.2 standards, that's acceptable because both of those standards include 2.0. There was nothing removed from 2.0 when moving to 2.1 and 2.2. So in most cases, we can actually point to that and say, if they're meeting those standards, then they're better than what we expected. So that is very useful and important to us. So if any other standard is listed, then you want to request a version that matches the US standard. So as I mentioned, there's an EU version and an international version. Either of those, while it can be kind of made parallel because the general needs of accessibility are going to be the same anywhere, it does make the interpretation of the report harder and makes it more, makes the whole process more burdensome. So we recommend that you use the Section 508 VPAT first, but the VPAT, the WCAG version of the VPAT is perfectly acceptable as well. Okay. Now, some red flags to look for with the introduction. As I've mentioned, if there is a mismatch with product and version. So for example, we have a name of a product, IT solution versus version 1.5, but let's say we're purchasing 1.7. Okay, that's something we need to concern ourselves with. What are the changes between 1.5 and 1.7? Or how expansive are they and such? 1.7, 1.5 to 1.7 indicates just two incremental steps. So there might be not as many changes, but it's still something that we need to ask about, saying, hey, what has changed between the two reports? The date of the report, how old it is our second thing to look for. So in this case, our example report is dated July 1st, 2020. At this point, that's 3 years out of date. So that means our report is very likely to not be covering content, new updates, any new sections. And so that means we can't really accept the content of the report as being valid anymore. Limited evaluation method is always another big thing. In this case, our example only says they use the Wave site checker. Wave is an automated page by page checking accessibility checker. And while those are very useful to use, they only cover about 30 to 40% of errors. There's a lot of subjective judgment used in determining if something is accessible or not. So simply using one of those, while it takes care of a lot of code violations and basic requirements, it doesn't cover a lot of the usability and feedback for users, especially those using assistive technology. So only using a single evaluation method or even just a single automated system means that we know there's probably going to be more to this than they have found. And then finally, again, wrong guidelines or none listed. In this case, they said WCAG level A. Well, what version of WCAG? 2.0, 2.1. You know, we also have a requirement here in Maryland to use AA as well. So that means that they're missing a whole section of those guidelines. So then we'd have to look at the rest of the report and see how much they filled out. And that's likely going to require us to go back to them and say, hey, we need more than just this group of standards. We need additional work done. All right, now the technical part of the report. This is where we get into where the subject matter experts are really going to be who you heavily rely on. And we're going to talk about really just kind of the layout, B, what you're going to be looking for, and then at least just some idea of anything that should prompt you to think about, hey, this might be a problem. You know, I'm not expecting anyone here to know all of the guidelines or how to test them or anything like that. I'm really looking for you guys to look at the report and say, okay, there are things on here that are not claiming to be supported, and why is that? And from there, so the report itself is separated by standard and groups. So, you know, as I mentioned, it goes WCAG 2.0, level A, then there'll be a section for level AA. And then on the 508 version, we'll have separate sections for the different chapters, like hardware and software and support documentation. The first column, as you saw the example earlier, lists the standard. It also links to it. So if you need to, you can go back to it and check the actual standard just to see what it is in case you're not familiar with it. The second column is where that conformance level is. So you have supports, partially supported, not supported, or not applicable. Every guideline should have that marked on there. Sometimes if they've meeting any of the AAA standards, they'll have added additional an additional section on there for that. So look for that as well. And then the third column is the explanation and remarks. And this can also refer to other standards that are applicable. And then finally, some element issues can be listed in multiple standards. So something like an image that is being used as a link might show up in the first item, 1.1.1, non-text content, but it might also show up in something like 2.4.4, link purpose and context, where if it's not meeting either of those guidelines, it shows up twice. So that depends again on the expertise of the person filling out the report. But it is something to keep in mind, is that things can violate multiple standards. So that's, and if it does, that's even more of an issue. So just look for that kind of thing as well. So here's a completed example. We have for 1.1.1, we have conformance level on the web is supported. Electronic documents is partially supported, and then software is not supported, and then the authoring tool is marked not applicable. Further remarks and explanations, the web is stating all images have alt text. Electronic documents just says none. Software is images do not alter workflow. And then authoring tool is product is not an authoring tool. And then for 1.2.1, they have audio only and video only, pre-recorded. Web is partially supported. Electronic documents is not applicable. software is supported, and authoring tool is not applicable. And then we have web, where some videos have a transcript attached. Electronic documents is none. Software is audio instructions are provided in text, and then authoring tool is none. So this is kind of what a very basic report should show, in that we have different types of each criteria is filled out depending on what the product is. In this case, let's think of it as a web-based application that has some support documentation in terms of PDF, but there is maybe a desktop app that is the software. And that's where it fills out those three criteria. But since it's not used in order to create content, then it's not an authoring tool. So authoring tools, you can think of things like Office or Publisher, things like that. Now, we're going to look at this and we're going to pick out the red flags. What should make us think about the actual accessibility of this product? And do we need either additional testing, or do we need to go back to the vendor and say we need more information or anything like that? So first off, we want to look at any criteria that's marked partially supported or not supported. And we want to make sure that there's a reason given, or the red flag is no reason given or potentially impactful reason given. So those are things we are paying attention to, because if there's no reason given, why? What's the problem? Why did you claim that only part of your product is supporting this criteria? Or if there's a reason given that's not supported because they don't feel it's worth the effort, well, then they need to back that up. So in the case of our example, electronic documents was partially supported and software was not supported for the first guideline, image non-text content, and electronic docs just says none. So what part of the documents does it not support? Is this saying that older documents are not including alt text, but later ones are? Is it random which ones are, which ones not, depending on who actually created the document? Or is it something like any electronic documents that are automatically created by the product are including alt text, but it's very simplified, or there's issues with it? What's the reasoning behind this partially supported? We need to know that answer. And then software is marked not supported, and the reason is given is images do not alter workflow. So the vendor in this case is saying that images aren't part of the main use case for this product according to the procurement, and so therefore they don't feel that it's necessary to go through and meet the criteria, or they have not taken the time to do so because they have decided that it's a lower priority. And again, in that case, this would be somewhere to bring in a subject matter expert, especially if they list out what images are present, or maybe we want to conduct a test of our own to say, well, is that true? And can the vendor prove to us that that's actually the case? Because if we find that it does, then we're going to have to require them to remediate it, or it may impact the judgment call of being awarded the product or the contract, depending on your procurement process. So again, as long as we understand what the remarks and explanations are saying, or if there's anything that makes you think twice about it, that's when you want to reach out to both the vendor and an SME in order to get more information and make a judgment call about it. Second thing is, again, insufficient details and explanation. So no indication of location and purpose. We need to know, like, where is this happening? Is it something that's going to be used a lot? Is it something that's going to be used in specific cases? Or is it an area that a user really shouldn't be able to get to, or is only going to get to if they're poking through every single corner of the product? So we need to make that priority call. So in the case of 1.2.1, where we say web is partially supported for video only content, and says some videos have a transcript attached. Well, we need to understand the purpose of those videos. Is it something where it's, again, older videos don't have it because the process of that time was not including this thing, but later videos are, in which case we can say, well, maybe that's not such a big idea because those older videos might be removed. And as long as all new videos are coming in with that transcript, we know that this is going to be supported in time. Or is it something like they only attach transcripts to like help videos that are showing how to do something, but they didn't do it for like promotions or ads? Well, in that case, okay, well, maybe the argument can be made that it's not as important. It's still something we need to be concerned about because a constituent might still come to that and say, hey, I want to know what this is, but it, or is it in the case of where it's again just kind of random depending on who was the person creating it? Person A who's creating videos for the website might know to do this and goes through that process, and person B doesn't realize that that's important or required and is not doing it. So then we're trying to figure out from the vendor, what is the impact of this, and is it going to be addressed? Now, third thing also is to look for sections that are marked not applicable that are actually applicable. Usually this is specific standards or sections for specific ICT. Like I mentioned earlier, if they're providing a software solution, they're not providing any hardware, then hardware is not going to be applied. But if it's something like a kiosk where they're providing kiosks, well, they might mark hardware as applicable, but they might not include web because the kiosk is not connecting to the web. However, software might still be applicable there, and we need to make sure it's meeting those guidelines. Or in the case of a specific standard where the vendor is thinking, oh, we don't provide this, so we're just going to mark it not applicable. So in the case of 1.2.1, the vendor might mark it not applicable because they're not providing that. However, if the product still has the capacity to do that, then we still need to test it. If we might not be purchasing it with videos on the website, but if it has the capacity to upload videos, we still need to make sure it can do things like captioning or transcription, or that the player has proper labels and such. And that's where we again have to follow up with the vendor and saying, hey, does it still have the capacity for this? Because we still need to know then. And that's again where we're dependent on the familiarity of the person doing the testing to actually look at it. All right, so before I get to following up, let me switch to the report itself quick, just so you guys can see it. I believe this is working correctly. Yes, it is. All right, so this is the Section 508 version. As I've mentioned, because of the overlap between NVA and Section 508, especially since NVA specifically pulls like the entire Chapter 5 of software from Section 508. That's really why we like to use this version. WCAG is still acceptable, but that's why I'm going to point to Section 508 here. So the start of this document is essentially just telling you what this does and how to fill it out and its various definitions. It also provides instructions for the vendor to fill it out themselves. So for whatever reason they've never done one before, it tells you how to do so. It's good to know some of the basics of the stuff again, like this part here that's saying this is what the definitions of the compliance level is. Supports, partially supports, does not support, and not applicable. So that's always good to know. Some people might use not evaluated there, which you'll sometimes see. I tend to see not applicable more often, but it's still a thing there. And then you have the separate sections for like Section 508 here. So this is always good to see, especially things like the best practices, what ITAI recommends, so that you're just aware of what you should expect to see in this document. Now I'm going to jump down to the actual report itself. So here's the start of it. So as I mentioned before, you have name, project, and version. You have the report date, description, contact information, notes, and evaluation methods used, and then applicable standards and guidelines. Again, we want to see more than just an automated check here, and then the more tools they use and more combinations of browsers and operating systems and such, the better. Especially as we get more into like mobile testing and mobile apps and such. Making sure again that they fill out the proper standards and guidelines. If you notice, this document states what's in it by default. So level A and level AA of WCAG 2.0, and then section 508 are included. Again, people can edit this if they wish, and they can say that, yes, we meet AAA. They might include it themselves. Or if you use WCAG version, this will say 2.1. They'll divide it between 2.0 and 2.1, and you'll see that breakdown as well. So it's just good to see that these are in here, and then people can use these and put the applicable things here. So those can be expanded on, but they should hopefully never be removed. Definitions are here again, and then it starts with WCAG 2.0. And then here's the breakdown. So you'll see again, you'll have the first table is the level A criteria. So basics like non-text content, captions, audio only, audio description, info and relationships, and then that breakdown of web, electronic docs, software, and authoring tools. It'll go through all of the separate guidelines. So hopefully all of these we should see depending on the type of product we're using. And then the more we see completed here and such, the better. If for whatever reason we see any of these marked as not applicable, or an entire guideline is ignored, that's a red flag. We need to make sure that we're looking out for that and ask the vendor, why was this not tested? Especially if it's something that potentially they might not understand. I have seen people sometimes not understand the difference between like labels and instructions and error identification, or things like focus order and on focus. So again, the person filling out this report needs to have some technical knowledge, and if they're only doing like some of these guidelines versus someone who's doing all of the guidelines, that's something we need to think about and ask, well, why did this not happen? Especially for the level A criteria, because that's really the foundation of making something accessible. Then you have table 2, which is the level AA requirements. So this is the next level of WCAG, where we have things like audio description, contrast, minimum, multiple methods. We have a heading structure in the website or electronic document, that things are consistent across the board. And then there is like error suggestion and error prevention. So having that ability to review things and such. As I've mentioned, depending on your own familiarity, there is links to the actual WCAG guideline itself. So if you're not familiar with it, you can go quickly look at it. But ultimately, what you're looking for more is that all of these have been addressed in some manner for whatever the type of product it is. And then for if you need, there is the AAA level here. Its conformance and remarks and explanation, that's really more on the vendor to fill out if they meet those guidelines and want to show, hey, we're better than everyone else. We're, meeting the highest level of accessibility. If we see this, great, that's something to keep, consider, but it is ultimately not required by the law itself. So if we see this, that should put them in favor. However, it's more expected to see A and AA. Then after that, here's the section 508 part, and this is where you need to think about the product type and where it meets. So all of the basic criteria has to be filled out. For purposes of Maryland, the top 3 are much more critical. So without vision, with limited vision, without perception of color, those are specifically covered by NVA. So those have to be showing a conformance level. The other areas do still need to be addressed as per ADA and such. But essentially think of it as we have a second guideline saying these 3 must be addressed. The others still need to be addressed, but if you don't address these, that's an automatic cutout. Or at the very least, you're going to need to say why and what you're going to do to fix it. But then it's broken into the separate sections. Like I said, hardware, kind of the same guidelines. There are some additional guidelines, if you notice, such as actual physical size and interaction. There's Chapter 5 software, which NVA has adopted entirely. So all of this needs to be addressed for anything like websites and such, or desktop software, anything like that. And then finally, you have support documentations and services. Then there's always a legal disclaimer here. As I mentioned, there is a notes section at the start. So if they're doing any additional work, or if they're saying, hey, we have plans to address these problems, they can also include that as a second thing. That's always good to know. Based on that, nope, wrong one. There we go. So when working with the vendor, you want to follow up and say, why are there missing explanations? What's the rationale behind it? If there's anything marked partially supported or not supported, you want to discuss plans for addressing that. Either the vendor can back it up and say, we are aware of this, especially if the report is older, and this is what we plan to do to fix it, which is great. That means they're addressing it proactively. In some cases, though, when we're, especially if we're either awarding a contract to them or already have a contract with them, in those cases, we need to discuss the plan for addressing this and come up with a mutually agreed upon plan. And then sometimes an SME might request a demonstration of the features to determine impact. Here in Maryland, if you're a state agency, we can assist with that. But it's things like when we mentioned, the guideline that said images don't alter workflow. Well, the vendor needs to prove that to us, because otherwise we're going to assume that, well, the images are still there and present, and therefore you're not providing all content to the non-visual user. So the plans can take different shapes, but ultimately what you're looking for is the ability to say, what is the priorities? So in our cases, that's typically level A stuff first, and then level AA. Anything that is directly in the main user workflow is always a higher priority as well. But we will typically, when we conduct a review, we'll determine those priorities and help determine what should be dealt with first and how quickly can they do it. And then the vendor should state, okay, this is when our next patch is, it will include these items, and then we're going to work on this next set. So essentially divide it into a standard development cycle. In Maryland, in the state agencies can contact us for VPAT reviews. We do that as well as product reviews, where if you have any questions about the VPAT, you can reach out to us. We'll look it over and we'll provide a report listing our concerns and what we expect remediation of. In some cases, we'll also state what needs to be prioritized for the vendor to fix. If the vendor is going to agree to do so, we can also assist with those direct discussions, can be brought in for those as well. I do recommend that you also still contact Do It for a procurement review. I know anything above a certain dollar value does require it, but anything below that, it's still always helpful to do so, and also include some of this process as well. And then finally, if for whatever reason there's issues with getting remediation done, or you want to come up with some kind of signed agreement regarding remediation, always involve your attorney general, or you can speak to Do It's attorney general to deal with the contract fulfillment, because ultimately Do It is responsible for the enforcement of the NVA. So you'll need to go to them and get them involved. With that, I believe I've covered everything. So if you have questions, I believe I saw one in the chat earlier. Please feel free to post them in chat and Q&A. If you want to contact us directly, you can reach out to us at mdod.nva@maryland.gov. We have our website you can look at for some additional resources on procurement. You can also see our training calendar on there. And then those of you who are in a state agency, you can submit a service desk ticket to Do It. We're part of that system. Just make sure that the subject of your email says IT accessibility request. I do recommend in the body of your email saying, please assign this to the IT accessibility group. And that's how you can request our services for reviewing a VPAT or reviewing a product. We do that as well. Those outside the state, we can do some advice, but we can't provide these kind of services. Now, first question is, why would workers in Maryland have a different standard than MSDE? I have heard that Maryland is required to meet or exceed the guidelines established in WCAG 2.1 level AA, but this is based on laws regarding digital tool approval for students. Thanks, just trying to clarify. The reason for that is because there is essentially two laws in play here. So the first one, the non-visual access clause that I've been discussing this whole time, that was established in 2005 and then updated in 2018. And that holds the state of Maryland responsible for procuring accessible IT solutions. So that is the one that refers directly to Section 508, and both NVA and Section 508 then refer to WCAG 2.0, because that's kind of what was in play at the time. So that's why I'm saying that. Now, 2021, or no, 2022, sorry, MSDE, there was a new law signed in, or a new proposal signed into law then that holds MSDE and the local school systems responsible for now meeting WCAG 2.1. So the reason that you're hearing that is because that law was specific to MSDE and the public school systems, elementary and middle and high school in the public arena. So there's those two laws in place. NVA is applicable to state agencies and those that they're working with, and this new law 7910, I believe is the number, is responsible for MSD in the school systems. I hope that helps. And then, okay, can you email the recorded link? Yes, I will do so. When I have the recording uploaded to YouTube, I will send it out. I will also include a copy of the slide deck and the VPAT for everyone to use at that time. Are there any other questions? Our website is banned by Firefox. Well, that's good to know. Thank you. I know the security certificate was being repurchased recently, so that might be why. Hopefully in a day or so, it'll be back up, but I will follow up on that. So thank you for making us aware. Always happy to help. I'm glad you get something out of them. Are there any other questions? Yes, go ahead. Do you recommend certain areas of the VPAT as more important than others? What are the non-negotiables? That's dependent on what your requirements are. So if I'm speaking in terms of the NVA for Maryland state agencies, that means WCAG 2.0, level A and level AA are required in some capacity. If they don't fill those out, then we need to ask why. And that can depend on them not understanding the guidelines to them stating they don't have anything in their product that it falls under that guideline, but that's where a subject matter expert probably should be involved. I wouldn't put anything as more important than another. It's more about what is applicable to the product you're purchasing. So in the case of like Section 508, as I've mentioned, if you're purchasing like a software package, like let's say the Adobe suite, in that case, since you're only buying software, there isn't any hardware involved. They don't need to fill out the chapter on hardware. So that might be marked as not applicable. But if you are dealing with like a website, and then it comes down to what is the capacity of that thing? Are they including in the videos, or if are you just using YouTube embeds? If you're just using YouTube embeds and they don't have the capacity to host video on it themselves, then they might not have the guidelines for like 1.2.1 or 2.2 for captioning and such. But there isn't anything I would declare as non-negotiable because they kind of are already by law. Like we have to, in some capacity, hit these things. Now, I do need to mention um, markets are only starting to mature in this arena, especially over the last few years as we come out of the pandemic and more people are building accessibility into their products. So a lot of, and then you're also dealing with the need to customize the product to your needs. You know, that typically happens when you're procuring a IT solution. So in those cases, it's more looking into what are the areas that we need to concern ourselves with that we need to address. So are there things in level A that say they're not supported? Well, this will need to be addressed at some point. When do you intend to do so? That kind of thing. You know, it's very, very unlikely, sadly, that you get a product that says we support everything and we're 100% accessible. That's very difficult to achieve. So you're kind of more making that judgment call of, is this going to be a problem versus product B, which is either more or less of a problem? And then what in the future do we need to consider and look for? The only thing I would say maybe is negotiable is something like AAA requirements, which we don't require by law. You know, if those are done, great. That means they're, you know, hitting a higher standard. But it is something that ultimately, you know, we're not going to say, oh, you don't meet those, you're disqualified. Um, but at this point in time, we can't really declare anything disqualified because it's a constant thing. You know, updates change these all the time. So we're having to make sure that the vendor understands what's needed and is going to work to fix it over time. And how quickly can they do that? I wish there was like a percentage that we could calculate to make the decision cut and dry. I mean, it would definitely make that easier. Unfortunately, as you know, a lot of these things kind of are subjective, especially when you're dealing with a rather large product like a piece of software, where you're going to have to look at every menu in order to make that thing. If you ever look at a VPAT filled out by like level access or GQ, they might include percentages. But typically those percentages are more of, this is how much of the product we have determined to be compliant. So it kind of gives you an idea of, I guess, how many issues are present, but it doesn't, you know, there is no weight to it because at least here in Maryland, we can't by law weight something more than another piece. You know, we can't say accessibility is more important than security. They have to be considered equally. So that depends on your organization and how they can do that. I would recommend looking at Minnesota IT Services and their thing because their accessibility resources, because they've done a somewhat different system where they do kind of have that judgment call. But a lot of that is also dealing with vendors' capability in-house to handle accessibility. So it's again more measuring not just the product, but then the vendor's capability to become accessible. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us. Okay, we are just over time. So I'm going to stop here